Greetings, I'm Shad and I love castles. I love all castles. I love historical castles and I love fantasy castles. Now when I say historical castle and fantasy castle, is there actually a difference between the two? Well, yes and no. It really depends on the type of movie, book or whatever that the fantasy castle is featured in. There are some fantasy castles that are very realistic and could have feasibly exist in a historical setting. But those are not the fantasy castles I'm going to be focusing on. I want to focus on the iconic fantasy castle, the kind of castle that is conjured up in your mind when you hear the term fantasy castle. So this type of castle is then the one that is featured in, the classic Disney movies or the medieval fantasy stories, books, and all those kind of things. So are those type of castles historical? No, they are not. And I want to point out what the differences are between the classic fantasy castle and the historical castle. Now, in the same way that we needed to define what the fantasy castle was, because there are some fantasy castles that are more historical than fantasy, we do need to define what the classic historical castle is like, because there are some historical castles that are far more fantasy-like than you would think. Like the castle you see before you right now, Chateau de Val, or like Hochostowitz Castle, Hohenwerfen Castle, the Crac de Chevalier in Syria, Malbork Castle. Some might point out Mont Saint-Michel as an example of a very fantasy-like castle, even though it's actually not a castle at all. And then, of course, there is the classic and beautiful Neuschwanstein Castle, which is indeed a castle, but it's not a historical castle. It was built in the 1800s. Now, these castles that I've just mentioned really are kind of the exception to the rule of what is the classic historical castle. Of course, it was castles like these that inspired the classic fantasy castle, particularly Neuschwanstein, because there was this castle that inspired Walt Disney to build the Disney Castle. And indeed, you can actually pick out some architectural similarities in Neuschwanstein and the Disney Castle. And it's the Disney Castle that is often used as the inspirational basis for every castle in every Disney movie, though officially it's the Sleeping Beauty Castle. I'll speak more about the inspirational foundations for the fantasy castle a bit later on, going back to historical castles. Are these massive, impressive and beautiful castles indicative of what the classic historical castle was like? In regards to the actual historical castles out of the list I just mentioned, so that's excluding Neuschwanstein and Mont Saint-Michel, they are indicative of classic historical castle design, but not size. You see, most classic historical castles were nowhere near as big. In regards to some of these exceptionally large historical castles, I need to point out that they didn't actually function the same way as a classic castle would. A classic castle would be a defensible building that also functioned as someone's residence. So they would live there, they would raise their children there, and would also serve a social and military function. But these larger castles, like Malbork Castle and the Crac de Chevalier, they kind of fall outside the category of being someone's residence, though people did live there, but more than one person. Malbork Castle is the castle of the Teutonic Order, at first to strengthen their control over the area, but later became their headquarters, their administrative centre. So more than being a residence, it was a command centre, and it was then that Malbork entered into its next phase of construction and became large as we see it today. In regards to the Crac de Chevalier, even though people consider it a castle, it is actually a fortress and functioned as a fortress throughout the entire period in which it was used. It acted as a centre of administration during that time, as well as a military base. And there's a mildly confusing part here, because every castle was a legitimate fortress. Indeed, if it didn't have the proper fortifications, the structure would not be a castle at all. But not every fortress was a castle. The thing that defined it to be a castle was if it was built in the medieval period with medieval-style battlements. That's the primary thing, and in a slight addition to that, it was also if it functioned as a residence, because most castles in the medieval period functioned as a legitimate residence, as well as the centre of government or administration for a particular area. So you can actually have castles that didn't function as a specific individual or family's residence, but these are rather the exception than the norm. If you were to try and define what the classic historical medieval castle is, it would be a defensive structure, fortified, so in that sense a fortress that was someone's residence as well. And so in regards to the really big castles, so the biggest historical castles amongst historical castles, their actual use and function kind of falls outside the realm of what a classic medieval historical castle was. The common historical castles were not as big as the Crac de Chevalier and Malbork Castle. In fact, the standard historical castle is actually deceptively small. Now you need to know and understand what I mean when I say that. Because for the common medieval building, castles were massive, but in comparison to modern buildings, castles they're not that huge. And when I say that, I mean the standard historical castle, not the exceptionally big ones. Again, these castles are more the exception than the rule. If you were to take away the walls of most medieval castles and just leave the actual living space, you will find that the keeps themselves, the main living quarters in a castle, are all very small. Especially when you compare it to, say, the Gothic cathedral. The size of and room inside a Gothic cathedral absolutely dwarfs the standard size of a castle's great hall or keep, and usually the great hall was in the keep. A great example of what I mean when I say this is Canavan Castle. From the outside, it looks huge. It looks absolutely massive. Just look at its big walls and towers. When in reality, the living space within this castle is actually quite small. It had a single great hall, then separate to the great hall, you have some kitchen rooms, and then you have rooms in each of the towers, and that's about it. What you also have to remember is that the walls of these towers are around 2 meters thick, so even though they look quite large on the outside, their internal volume or space is much smaller. This is not the type of castle with so many rooms that you would get lost within the building. A classic example of what I feel is a very indicative and standard size of a classic medieval castle is Malbork Castle. Just like with Canavan Castle, what we notice here is that the biggest thing about this castle is actually the walls, not the living quarters. Now, Malbork was unfinished, but here is a picture of what it would have looked like if it was finished. It's deceptively big, just like Canavan Castle, because even from this picture, we do see a lot of internal windows facing into the bailey, but in comparison to, say, something like a palace, there is nowhere near as many rooms. And you have to remember how thick those outer defensive walls are, especially on the keep and the gatehouse. 1 to 2 meters thick, sometimes even thicker, and so that actually will take up a lot of internal room. If we go back to some of the older Norman keep castles, we find that again they're even smaller. They look huge on the outside, but you need to put it in perspective. Hardingham Castle only has space for 1 room on each level. Let's look at Chateau De Chillon. Now this is a castle that really does look like an inspirational basis for the classic fantasy castle, and it is very much on the larger end of the spectrum in classic historical castles. And from the castles that I have studied, Chateau De Chillon has far more internal living space than many other historical castles. But again, if we have a look at the internal layout of this castle, we will find that it is not a structure that you could get lost in. It is not so massive as what most fantasy castles are depicted like. And in the larger scheme of things, Chateau De Chillon's internal living space actually isn't that huge. Again, historical castles are deceptively small and much smaller than what most people think of when they think of a fantasy castle. The other distinction that needs to be made in regards to historical castles is in regards to the embellishments on the outside. Now, I find these buildings absolutely beautiful. They just boggle my mind. Having said that though, they are not palaces. You need to understand what I said, that many castles did function as legitimate palaces, but an actual palace is a separate kind of building. What I should really say, a dedicated palace. Many castles could be palaces or function as a palace, but not every palace was a castle. You see, a palace is a structure designed for holding ceremonies. It is a statement of wealth and power. And so it is very, very important for palaces to just be unbelievably beautiful in every kind of regard. Embellishments everywhere, and you do not find that level of excess or embellishments on castles. You see, castles are first military structures that also function as a legitimate residence. They need to be strong and defensible, and as most castles in history weren't palaces, though some were, like Canavan Castle, most were not palaces, and they were nowhere near as dressed up as what you would expect a palace to be. In contrast to that, the classic fantasy castle is dressed up. Indeed, nearly every fantasy castle, especially the Disney castles, function as a palace as well as a castle. And they really kind of try and merge those two together. The classic castle and the classic palace. So now let's look at the classic fantasy castle and its key identifying features. When I look at the classic fantasy castle, I see the combination of three historical structures: the historical castle, the historical palace, and the historical Gothic cathedral. The fantasy castle generally has design elements from these three historical structures. And then they kick it up a notch in size. Fantasy castles are usually massive and far, far, far bigger than any historical castle ever was. Don't get me wrong, the smaller end of fantasy castles can match the sizes of the largest ends of historical castles, specifically Malbork Castle, which is the largest castle in the world by surface area. The fantasy castle really finds its origin in the popularization of fairy tales through animation, and we can largely thank Walt Disney for that. And in my opinion, I do kind of feel Walt Disney really helped romanticize the notion of a castle far more than it had been before. I would have loved them regardless, but when he designed Disneyland and the classic Disney castle, he made such a beautiful building. And you have to call a spade in regards to that. The classic Disney castle is just stunning. It is not a historical castle. Now remember when I said that they drew a lot of inspiration from Neuschwanstein when designing the classic Disney castle? Well, they also drew inspiration from many cathedrals and palaces. But because the fantasy castle is called a castle, and the main castle that they drew inspiration from in the design of the Disney castle was Neuschwanstein, you could rightly call Neuschwanstein the true basis and foundation for the classic fantasy castle. Because Neuschwanstein was built so recently in regards to castles in the world, it didn't need to focus on the main primary design elements that you would generally put on a historical castle, meaning defense. And because the concept and idea of the palace was so well established in this period, many palace design elements were added. And indeed, this castle was made to look aesthetically beautiful, not imposing or defensible, which is a key difference in Neuschwanstein to basically every historical castle ever built. And this building really did capture the imagination of many, many people, myself included. It is just absolutely beautiful. We just need to remember that Neuschwanstein is nowhere near an accurate representation of what a real historical castle is or was like. And because of that, Neuschwanstein shouldn't really be considered a real castle, because it can't fulfill the role that a real castle was supposed to. Its battlements are mostly aesthetic, and though it has a commanding position that would be hard to get to, its walls would not be able to survive any impacts from trebuchets. A person could fit through nearly every window from the outside, and the gatehouse is not effectively designed at all to repel attackers. And so if a castle is supposed to be able to effectively repel attackers and protect those who are living within it, Neuschwanstein, again, is not a real castle. But it is a castle, and I'm not saying we shouldn't call it a castle. We should just know that it's not a real castle. This is a fairy tale or fantasy castle. So the main differences between a historical castle and a fantasy castle is first, size. The common historical castle was nowhere near as big as many people think. The next big difference is the outward embellishments. A real historical castle is more concerned about being defensible and fortified than being fancy and embellished. Embellishments were indeed put on historical castles, but never at the detriment to its fortifications. And a big element of these fancy outward embellishments are windows. Big windows look amazing, and it also makes the building more livable on the inside because it brings more light. But windows are a huge weakness on castles. They would never have any outward facing windows that were large enough for a person to climb through, especially on the lower levels. There is some exceptions on some castles on the higher up levels, especially if the main keep is so high on, say, like a hill or something like that, and it has all its main defensive walls lowered down. Well, then you'll find larger windows on castles like that, but again, those are internal windows protected by an external wall. You will never have windows facing the outermost side of castles anywhere on a real historical castle. So a big difference actually between fantasy castles and a real historical castle are windows, as well as all the beautiful and fancy stonework that we find on Gothic cathedrals and not on real historical castles. So there you go, these are what I see as the main differences between a historical castle and a fantasy castle. And to finish us off, I'm just going to show you Honor Guard, a castle I specifically designed to kind of bridge the gap between a historical castle and a fantasy castle. So really, it is a fantasy castle because it has some design features that you would never find in the same period in a historical castle, but I made it to be far more historically accurate than what most fantasy castles are depicted as. Its main purpose is to be fortified and practical as a defensive structure, though it has larger windows where I could put them that wouldn't be detrimental to its defense. It has some later architectural design styles that you see more on palaces, like the big feature window above the keep, and I certainly let the aesthetic appeal, how the structure looked as a whole from the outside, affect its design. I wanted this castle to look beautiful, which did actually make the internal layout a bit tricky in all honesty, because if you were to build a castle for pure practical reasons, there are some things that you would not have on this castle. For one, this giant tower. But having a huge tower like this is such a classic fantasy element, and it looks so beautiful as well, of course I had to put it on. And this central higher part of the keep that kind of just stands above the main square body. This is very architecturally impractical, specifically for the load-bearing points. It makes making the internal layout tricky because there has to be support for the corners of this building, which essentially run right down halfway in the middle of the main square body of the keep. So in this sense, this is actually not a practical design, but it looks so good in my opinion that this is how I wanted it to look, and so I forced the internal design to match accordingly. And I love this castle. I would totally build it if I ever became a billionaire. It is how I bridge my love for historical real castles and the glorious, beautiful fantasy castles. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, farewell. If you would like to support Shadiversity or express appreciation for a video that you particularly enjoyed, please become a patron through Patreon. Your $1 donation would be absolutely wonderful.